to start our podcast as we always do. How's the pandemic this week?
Somehow hasn't been at the forefront of my mind. Probably the first time in a while.
Yeah?
I mean, the news has taken a break from the pandemic being the biggest thing. It's been the election for the past 2 weeks. So...
Absolutely.
I mean, not really a break, just a different thing.
Right. That is starting to shift a little bit recently. I just looked up some statistics before we recorded the podcast, and as of November 11th, 11 out of the 50 states have met one of the CDC's 4 benchmarks for controlling a pandemic, or controlling a coronavirus outbreak in their state, and the other 39 states have met none of the 4 benchmarks.
Yikes.
So... I believe we're getting 120,000 cases a day or so.
Over 100,000 at least.
Yes. Things are pretty bad right now.
Yeah, at least in terms of case numbers. Fortunately, the deaths haven't gone... there's been a slight rise in deaths, but not, maybe what we would expect corresponded to that.
No.
And it seems like the two major reasons for that are, A, we're just better at treating it, which is amazing. And also... it's hitting younger populations, which are less likely to die.
Yes, or be hospitalized in general.
Yeah.
I was on a call just yesterday about careers in the medical device industry, basically. And one of the women on the call was talking about how their company switched over a whole factory to making ventilators. Way back in March, there was this huge panic of, are we going to have enough ventilators for all these people? Because it's kind of a niche, high-end medical device, but it was really in high demand for treating coronavirus in the early days of the outbreak. And this woman on the call yesterday was saying, basically, it's not a concern anymore. They just don't use ventilators because we figured out how to treat COVID before people get that bad.
That's good. Yeah, I know that my university they haven't really done anything major, but they have definitely kind of done some tonal shifts in terms of their messaging about how a while ago they had a stay-at-home order, and there's been nothing official, but they kind of tightened some restrictions a little bit, and they seem to really be just trying to make it to Thanksgiving when many of the students go home, and all classes go online. Although I was talking with someone today in the know, and it seems like a lot of students are actually going to stay on campus, because you basically, at my university, have the option to come back after Thanksgiving break. All your classes would still be online, or most of them would still be online. But you could still live in the dorms if you wanted to. And it seems like there's a decent number of people who are still going to do that. My university is offering testing to anyone who wants it, who's a student, before they go home, which is super nice.
Yeah.
Free testing. Just be like, oh yeah, you want to get a test for COVID before you go home to your parents? Yeah, that makes sense. You can do it.
Yeah, I think my university's doing something similar. I'm not sure exactly. Something that's on my mind, I'm getting a flu shot tomorrow. I made sure to get that done, just because this year is a bad year to get the flu.
Yeah. No, my university offers flu shots, and I need to sign up for a time to do that.
So, that's our life in the pandemic right now. I'm a little apprehensive about Thanksgiving, I will say. Cases are projected to go up. My family, at least the last time I spoke with them, my family was certain that Thanksgiving would go on as planned, and we couldn't really exclude anyone. So
interesting.
Yeah, I think it will probably be fine, but there's a chance that things go very badly.
And that's always where it is with these things, is even if you are at risk and you get COVID, it's probably going to be fine, but...
Yes. Things are getting worse, but personally I don't feel it yet, probably because I was distracted by the election as well.
Yeah, no, definitely bad for my sleep schedule and productivity. Moving into our main topic for this episode, which is kind of male gender norms. People would toss around the word like toxic masculinity, but I think that encompasses, that's like a subset. There is a part of there are problems with male gender norms, and there's a small part of that is toxic masculinity. But I think when people talk about this topic, they get really wrapped up in that because it sounds flashy, but there's a whole host of other more subtle things that I think don't get talked about very often.
Yeah, and the podcast is called In My Experience because we wanted to talk about things that we have personal experience with. We're not experts by any means in anything yet, and so we can speak from our own experience, and that's what's valuable. That's what we bring to the table that's new and unique. And the last several podcast episodes have been primarily informative, which isn't bad, but we wanted to try and bring the tone of this episode, at least, and the podcast as a whole, back towards our mission, which is speaking personally. We are two men.
Yeah, men.
We thought that talking about the way we've experienced gender norms and what it means to be a male in American society would be really useful, and to share some of the things in our life that are unusual and some of the things that are very normal for American men to experience.
And I think a little bit of context before we really get into it. Me and James are both cis men. We are white, and our communities and schools, especially high school, was predominantly white. We went to a Christian school. I would say that our school wasn't necessarily like super conservative in most senses of that word. It wasn't, overtly liberal either. So even the idea of thinking about different like levels of masculinity or like what it means to be a man, that wasn't something we didn't. It's not like we didn't talk about that, but there are certainly communities where that is more on the table than maybe it was in ours, and there are certainly communities where it was less on the table than it maybe was in ours.
For example, a typical sign of toxic masculinity is using the word gay as an insult.
Yeah.
And there are definitely social circles at our high school who still do that, who use gay as an insult. We were not part of them,
no.
But they were there.
That wasn't really something that, at least outside of maybe middle school, that I ever experienced.
No. And on the other end of the spectrum, our high school was one of the most accepting of transgender students in our area. We had dedicated non-gender bathrooms for students.
Yeah, I think that those got put in while we were students, I believe.
Yes, specifically because some of the freshmen, a year or two below us were transgender. And
we're more outwardly transgender.
Yes, yes, thank you.
In a way that the administration would have to deal with it, versus there were people in our grades who were transgender or gender nonconforming, and in a way that the administration didn't have to deal with as much.
Right, or at least was not aware of it or chose not to deal with it. And so our personal experience comes from a broad range of cultural experiences with masculinity, I think is the point here. The friend group that the two of us were part of, the social group we were part of, was, I think, really unique and one of the biggest blessings in my life.
I would agree.
Because the moniker we keep is the dudes.
Yeah, at least for our guys. So,
yes.
our friend group, part of what made our friend group so great is it was, it had guys and girls, and it
was large and diverse.
There was a lot of intermingling. There are definitely friend groups where there is a barrier there. There's like, there's the girls of the group and the guys of the group. That wasn't so much the case with ours.
No. That being said, there was a clear group of all the guys, and we all got along. We all have a group chat.
The dudes.
And that group of guys was uniquely supportive and emotionally vulnerable and kind and accepting in ways that I know a lot of male friend groups are not.
Yeah, most definitely. One way that our conversation might be different than how I think masculinity and the problems with it, or and where it can go wrong in male gender norms, is I think we will probably try to focus on the positive experiences we've had instead of just saying this is bad. Say, this is a success story, this is how things can go well. Mm-hmm. Certainly all of our experiences with male gender norms haven't been good ones, but we have personally found ways to incorporate what being a man to us means, while not falling into all of the traps.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I valued most about being a part of a friend group of guys who was so accepting is that external markers of masculinity were not as significant because we all knew and had a grounded sense of who we were as men internally.
Yeah.
For example, you dye your hair purple. You did dye your hair purple.
I did. I've dyed my hair's not purple now, but I did dye it purple. Very fun.
You paint your nails. I from time to time enjoy wearing dresses.
I know. You own more. It's ridiculous. Like, I'm much more like effeminate. I'm pretty effeminate.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that you, who, if we haven't mentioned this, have like a bit, a beard, and you wear your plaid shirt, very much like lumberjack vibes sometimes. Own two dresses, and I do not. I need to acquire some. just for sake of competition.
Oh, they're very comfortable too. But that's a sign of external femininity that both of us are comfortable displaying that most guys would not be. And It's not just, I put on the dress because it's funny. No, I actually wear it. It's like a nightgown. I think it's comfy. And so those experiences, I think, for us are fairly normal within our friend group. But for maybe our average listeners sound very strange or unusual.
I mean, I think painting nails is a good example of something that like, oh, no big deal, right? And it's easy and it's, accessible. I think at least half, if not more, of the guys in our friend group have at some point, like, just had painted nails, and not because we're all like super femme, because we're not, but just like I remember one time one of our friends was like, oh yeah, like this is for a cause or whatever, or someone's like, oh, I just tried this out once. Now me, I paint my nails fairly consistently. I probably once or twice a month, but it seems like most of the guys in our group were at least at some point in their life comfortable with like being in public with painted nails, which is like, at least it seems to me like that shouldn't be a big deal.
No.
But I know in some circles that would be a bigger deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it wasn't until I got to college that I recognized this is kind of weird. Other people don't have emotionally vulnerable male friendships the way that I do. And one way that stood out to me recently, I was talking with a friend, and she mentioned that women are very used to being emotionally vulnerable in friendships. But men really only expect or experience emotional vulnerability in romantic relationships. And so if a woman is trying to be friends with a man and is emotionally vulnerable in that relationship, the man automatically assumes that there's a romantic interest, because that's the only context he knows for emotional vulnerabilities like that. And my friend was pointing out that this is, it's a common theme of male and female friendships failing.
Oh, it's totally a stereotype.
Yeah.
Well, or it's a stereotype of inside of romantic relationships of where, this can happen both ways. I've seen it firsthand happen both ways. Mm-hmm. But the common kind of stereotype is that when two people are dating, the guy just unloads, and a heterosexual couple, unloads all of his emotional baggage onto his partner, whereas the woman has a support system so that, she can lean on the guy, but she has other places to turn to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in our friend group, because, from at least from sophomore year of high school, like the dudes had really like found its footing in terms of like how we treated each other. And, we could have emotional conversations. We could talk about things that sucked or things that were good and use emotive, vulnerable language. And we could be self-effacing and talk about how we had failed at something, or how we were disappointed in ourselves, or how we were embarrassed. And I think that being in a friend group of guys where like you can have a real heart-to-heart about like something you were embarrassed about or something you don't understand or need help with is uncommon. And I think that has helped, I know at least me, at least following your friend's logic, form friendships with women, because
yes,
that's just like normal for me. I don't assume it's like, oh yeah, we're emotionally vulnerable. It means we're like close.
Right. Really, all of the guys in our friend group, at least the ones who are able to be emotionally vulnerable with the other guys, have significant female friendships in their life.
And often more female friends than male friends. I know that some of us have found the struggle with college is when we moved to college.
You in particular.
Me in particular, and I also know that one of our friends who also goes to the same institution as you.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Yeah, and I've heard to lesser extent similar stories from other dudes of that, like, it's so hard to make friends with guys.
Because they can't be emotionally vulnerable.
Which seems weird. Yeah, because we've got our dudes and we're like, what is this? What is this, like, lack of emotional, like, what? And so it's in my personal experience has been, it's so much easier for me to make friends with girls than with guys. I have a friend group of 6 girls and me, the only guy at college, and I have a couple of guy friends who are, more of acquaintances than close friends, really. And I've tried. It's just, I have, the dudes. I obviously like being friends with guys. It's just like, it's harder. What do I talk about with them?
Yeah, I got really lucky my freshman year. My roommate was emotionally developed and interesting, and I have a close emotional friendship with him. But the friend group that the two of us were a part of, all the other guys there were gym bros, for lack of a better word, and they talked about working out, and they got drunk on the weekends and they were often verbally or physically abusive towards each other, and in a friendly way, but it wasn't the type of interaction that I was used to, and I just wasn't really comfortable in that social setting. And so in some sense, the emotional maturity of our high school friends has proved a barrier to making male friends in college. I agree.
Yeah. Not to go on about the dudes forever, but, when we see each other, usually we'll say, I love you when we're leaving, which, I do with my college friends that are girls now too, just because, oh yes, we are close. I platonically love you and I want you to know. But I think especially amongst guys our age, it certainly happens, but ending a phone call with a male friend that you haven't seen in a while, or hanging out, ending with, oh, love you, see you later.
Right.
Feels weird to them.
Yeah, that's true. In some sense, I'm not sure if I would have made more close male friends if I'd been at college longer. The pandemic really interrupted a traditional American college experience for me.
Yeah.
Which I'm not entirely disappointed about. I've got great friends from high school, and I'm happy to keep them and not necessarily make new ones.
Yeah.
Or at least not abandon all my high school friends for college friends, as is the cultural concept of what it means to go off to college.
Yeah. I think in general, and also I think we can specifically attest to this, an area where kind of traditional masculinity really breaks down is in terms of like receiving useful feedback in ways that are serious but also kind.
Yes.
Especially about things like interpersonal interactions or social cues or emotional expression. Mm-hmm. I think that is something that everyone struggles with this. But I think men struggle with it in a specific flavor, if you will. Mm-hmm. It is really hard for many people, and I know that when I was younger, it was harder for me too, to not only, give kind feedback, to say, hey, like, whether what you said there wasn't cool, or, oh, hey, like, it seems like you were a bit off today. But I think where men, particularly stereotypically and in reality, really struggle is in receiving feedback well, and not just kind of taking it personally, if you will.
Right. And often I think that it comes out in a lot of anger in guys,
Yeah.
I have seen a lot of men respond with anger to criticism. Yeah, I was just thinking, just recently, I was thinking about asking someone on a date and was reprimanded because I didn't take it very seriously. I was bored. I wanted to go on a date. And someone reprimanded me and said, hey, you should be more careful. That could be emotionally damaging to someone to, be excited about a date and then find out you're just doing it because you're bored. And yeah, they were right. I don't think that was a poor reason to ask someone on a date, and I was inconsiderate about how I did it. 4 years ago, I don't think I would have been able to receive that feedback without getting really angry. But the emotional maturity that the culture of the dudes has, and through personal growth, even outside of that social circle, has equipped me well to dealing with that kind of criticism.
Somewhere else where I've really noticed it amongst our friend group is I have ADHD, right? Which often manifests itself as talking really loud or talking over people, interrupting people, not in an intentional way, but just I won't notice kind of getting too excited almost, or just getting too loud or too into something.
Yeah.
And some of our friends, specifically the one that I talked about earlier that goes to your institution, are really good about just kind of kindly, generously reminding me, being like, hey, Noah, quiet a little bit, or shooting me a text and being like, hey, even if I've been in a situation where I'm talking in a circle with people and someone will text me and be like, hey, let so-and-so talk.
Right.
And that's really useful for me. And I think that it's an area that I have had to develop, and that I know that when I was younger, early high school, it would be really hard for me to hear that and not feel like I was being personally attacked.
Yeah. And
often that would come out with feeling really guilty, and not in a productive way. But now I'm to the point where I have people who are confident that they can comfortably just be like, hey, Noah, quiet down a little bit, or or just saying, you interrupted me. I'd be like, oh, yep, I did. Sorry, go on.
Right. And so I guess all of these things we're talking about could be lumped under toxic masculinity, but I think more broadly it's just the emotional intelligence of men.
Yeah.
And that we live in a society that doesn't prioritize or value emotional intelligence for men.
Particularly towards other men.
Us especially, yes, towards other men. And this is something that our specific social circumstance has developed in us. And this is something that I have worked very hard on developing personally over the last year. About a year ago, I recognized that the stressors of college and being out of a familiar environment with my familiar support structures left me feeling really unhinged isn't quite the right word, but I felt unstable emotionally. And it caused some damage in some personal relationships. And so I felt very strongly that improving my emotional intelligence was an important goal for 2020. 2020 has been a disaster of a year. So many goals have been upended. But this is one I've actually done fairly well on, and I'm very proud of the progress I've made. And so for our listeners who perhaps would love to be a part of a social group where male emotional intelligence is prioritized, you can change the culture that you're in to some extent. For example, I think that some of the things you went through our freshman year really formed and bonded the guys around being an emotional support structure for each other.
Yeah, to paraphrase very, very quickly, our freshman year, for various reasons, but a main one being some interpersonal stuff, I was a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
And so I needed a support structure, and so turned to the dudes. And I think that we certainly had things before that, but that was always a good example we could look back upon.
Yes.
Of, oh, here's when one of the dudes was going through crap, and then here are the things that worked for that. Let's do that for everybody else.
Yep. And so I think that, even one person's boldness to push a culture to be a certain way can change that culture. Another thing that our listeners might be happy to hear is what I've gone through over the past year. Emotional intelligence is something you can improve in yourself.
Definitely.
If you are intentional, if you are practiced, it is certainly something you can get better at.
Most definitely. I think that so often friend groups of guys will try to keep everything light. Mm-hmm. Like, often they'll go to, like, humor, or if that's not working, just kind of attacking the situation.
Humor or complaint, usually.
Humor or complaint. I know that people express how they care about each other in different ways, and that's totally fine. But I think that there are certain things that you can do to demonstrate how you care for someone that project emotional availability. I think trying out saying, like, I love you to a guy, if you have never said that before, don't just, like, do that out of the blue. But, like, if you've had a good conversation with someone, be like, oh, hey, I love you, man.
Yeah.
See how they react.
Mm-hmm.
Or give your guy friends a hug.
Yeah.
Like, a real hug. Like a hug. I mean, not right now. There's a pandemic. But, there's, like, the tap on the back and stuff. But, like, when you can, when it's safe, like, give your guy friends, like, a real hug. Like, a hug.
They need it. I promise you.
Yeah.
And to some extent, yeah, people express love in different ways. I don't think there's any substitution for certain things. Saying I'm sorry, saying I love you.
Yeah.
I find it really hard to accept substitutions for that.
And I think just the kind of umbrella topic of self-effacing language, talking about how you are actually feeling. Now, men and women both struggle with this, but, guys especially, of just saying, using words like, I'm sorry, that was awkward, I messed up there, how can I make it better? Or, how are you feeling? That must have been really rough. Do you want to talk about that more? I think that those little things that can lead into more vulnerable emotional conversations kind of go below the surface. Taking that first step is often really hard in kind of cultural, social environments that are not used to showing weakness or letting your guard down.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird connection, but hear me out. I'm calling to mind a recording I saw of Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood appearing before Congress about funding for the public broadcasting service. Fred Rogers is a Presbyterian minister and has a doctorate in psychology, I believe. It may just be a master's. Don't quote me on that. But when he was talking about the value of public television, he said before Congress, he sang a little Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood song. I can stop when I want to. I don't remember the rest of the song, but it was something about basically controlling your anger and stopping yourself from doing actions that are destructive. And that's something that a toddler needs to hear, that a child needs to hear. But Fred Rogers pointed out, especially, think about how much destruction our country would be saved if young men everywhere could hear, hey, you're feeling angry, but you are in control of your emotions and you can stop if you want to. I think a lot of men in the country are just uncontrolled, and that it is important, not just for their own good, but for the good of society, that we have men who are emotional masters of themselves and can be controlled.
Yeah. We often talk about the aggressive emotions with men, specifically anger, and I don't talk about that much just because anger has never been my problem. I generally don't get angry, I get sad. But I think that anger is a problem for men in general because it is accepted by society in some ways.
Yes.
It is more culturally acceptable for, say, if you have a heterosexual relationship, like, it is more societally acceptable for, say in public, like, for a man to raise his voice, or a man to, like, kind of take charge, or just aggressively dominant in ways that are not productive or really kind.
Certainly.
In a way that it is not accepted for women, but also it is very much shamed, or maybe shame is not the correct word, but it is not so much accepted for, say, a man to cry. There are still, I know people who their parents told them when they were a kid, boys don't cry. Mm-hmm. That is still a thing that people say. And so I think we end up with this kind of conceptualization of being a man, and the emotions associated with being a man is that you are supposed to be, there's still some level of, like, okay, be a good person, but you are supposed to be aggressive. You're supposed to be loud. If something happens and you don't like it, you're supposed to kind of get riled up and push back against it because you're a man and you do what you want in this world. And that's problematic for the reasons that, those aggressive emotions carry with them. But also it means there are just situations in life that cannot be productively processed through aggression. They can only really be processed by slowing down, by contemplation. And sometimes you just need a good cry.
Absolutely.
And we have, many men are told growing up, or told, by societal cues that crying, that needing to ask for help, that feeling like they can't get out of bed in the morning, that is just the antithesis of what it means to be a man.
Absolutely.
Which I don't think it is.
A high school classmate of ours developed cancer while she was in high school, and her condition worsened significantly during our senior year and passed away January of 2020. Going through that process of watching a good friend suffer and die is the most painful thing I've experienced yet. And having a group of guy friends where it was acceptable to cry and to grieve, and we could support each other and understand those emotions and have room for them, got me through it. I think that I would be a lot more bitter and angry and destructive today if I didn't have a support network of men who allowed me to grieve like that. Because to some extent, the death of a friend can't be met with anger, right?
You can't do anything about it.
No. And grief and sadness and days where you don't want to get out of bed are what comes with that. And so I think that we have a societal idea that men can just go out and conquer the world with anger.
And if you can't, well, you should get drunk.
Right, of course.
I'm a peer educator. I talk about substance misuse, so of course that's on my mind. But I think something that maybe we haven't touched on is that it's not that society has no answers for emotions that men don't know how to deal with. It's just that they have the wrong ones. There are societal answers, and often I think that is either aggression, whether it's anger or just frustration. It can also be just complete ambivalence. Not in all circles, but some circles certainly prize kind of this stoic level of taking whatever comes to you and not feeling anything about it.
Right.
Which just, that's not how people work.
No.
And then if neither of those work, well, always just drink.
Yes.
And none of those are often productive answers.
No.
So I think there are some things that come along with the conceptualization of men, and specifically male friend groups, that aren't as tied in with emotional intelligence, that are still important to examine. One that me and James are very familiar with is a idea that for men it can often be hard to justify hanging out if there isn't some activity or some sort of purpose or point. Think of, men, stereotypically, the men get together and hang out to watch the game, whereas women, they just drink wine and chat.
Right.
And why I mentioned that James and I know it well, the podcast.
Yes. So this past summer, we realized that it is difficult for us to maintain friendships while we are separated geographically. And it is difficult for us to feel like we are doing things that are not productive in a rather narrow sense of that word. And so this podcast is something we can achieve and check off so we feel productive. But it's also an excuse to just talk to each other.
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous, honestly. But, whatever works.
I heard a story one time about a woman who was suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder and was dealing with obsessions that she had left her hair curler on and she was going to burn her house down. And she was getting up at 5 a.m. To leave for work, which didn't start till 9 a.m. because she had to turn around and go back to her house 6 or 7 times during her commute to make sure she'd unplugged her hair curler. And she went to numerous psychologists and tried all sorts of medications to figure out how to stop this obsession before a friend of hers who heard about this problem just said, unplug the hair curler and bring it with you to work. And then it's not plugged in. And so I think that this podcast is in a similar way a little psychological loophole that we call each other for 2 hours once every other week, and we feel like we're being productive, and it's a rhythm that we keep. Whereas if we didn't have the podcast, I would like to call and talk with you for 2 hours every other week, and I just wouldn't do it.
I don't think there's anything wrong with what we're doing. I'm very happy with it, but I think that it is a pointed example of a broader trend of that it's much harder definitely for guys to just justify doing things together. And I think part of that is there's probably more of a kind of productivity complex in men. I'd say, it's probably more common. But I think also there is a level that is part emotional availability, and I think part the narrow, and it's broadening, which is good, but there's often in some circles kind of a narrow interest of interests that are like, okay, this is kind of the typical range for what guys are interested in.
Yes. Guys do sports, or guys play video games, or guys work in the shop.
Yeah. And that, I think, is different in different friend groups. Thinking like your stereotypical group of nerds or whatever, like that's certainly going to be different. But I think often groups of guys, no matter what those interests are, they are often narrower in terms of what is considered normal for that group. And not that those interests are wrong, I just think that it often doesn't leave room for people who maybe don't share those interests. And also, I think it can run dry almost. I think part of the reason why guys might struggle to hang out if there isn't an activity is that, especially in groups where the members are not super emotionally available and also maybe feel like they are only supposed to be, super outwardly interested in these certain things, you just kind of run out of stuff to talk about. And so you need to play video games, or you need to watch a game, or you need to go for a hike or whatever, just because what do you talk about? And that's the problem I ran into with guys at college of just like, what do I talk about with you? Right.
I think this is one of the many reasons that video games are a male-dominated field, because a video game is a way that you can have common activity with male friends even when you're geographically separated. It's almost stereotypical to hear someone say, "Oh, I'm going to go play COD with the boys," and you don't really hear women say that. "Oh, I'm going to go play COD with the girls," because men have social activity around common interests, common activities. Another example of this is high school sports teams or college sports teams. I know a lot of friend groups that were just sports teams, and the reason all of them were friends is because they had a very narrow, specific, common activity. We're the soccer team. We're all friends. We're a friend group, and we're the soccer team.
Yeah, and I think the distinction to be made is like there are women who play video games and there are girl sports teams.
Absolutely.
And of course those can, we are talking in averages and generalities. There are always going to be, groups that don't fit. Mm-hmm. But I think what is really we're getting at is I think that it is the service that they provide. I think that there are many more guys who like talking with someone while they play video games with them, or talking with a guy while they watch a sports game or a movie or whatever. Just that is when they talk to that person.
Right.
Groups that are primarily women will do those same activities, watch a movie together, play a game, but I think are more likely to, on average, that is not where they have their real conversations. When they're having a conversation, when they're just talking with people, that's all they're doing. The only purpose there is to just understand each other and talk.
Yeah.
And I think that with sports teams, you definitely get that with girls too, but I think often there's more of a kind of pack mentality when it comes to male sports teams, or there is more of an exclusive, like, these are my people, this is my group.
Right. Perhaps the most extreme example of this, my roommate has a friend of his, and they exclusively talk about Marvel Cinematic Universe fan theories. And they will talk for hours about it, and they're great friends, but they never talk about anything else. And it's kind of weird. I don't think I can remember meeting a guy who didn't want to be funny, and I don't think that funny is something that a lot of girls aspire to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, most definitely not in the same way. Some of the funniest people I know are women. I'm not saying, we are not saying that girls can't be funny.
No, certainly not.
I think what we are saying is that it's almost, I feel, a requirement for many guys to feel like they are socially competent is, can they make people laugh? Are they funny?
Yes.
In a way that is absent in some female friend groups or in some women.
It's like you said, it's not so much about women can't be funny, men have to be funny, but men really value being funny, and women, it's often not as important for them to be funny.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are exceptions. There are female stand-up comics, but male social dynamics are ruled both by common activity, which we touched on, and also by humor. And I think that from an outsider's perspective, I think that would really stand out, is all of these guys who are hanging out, it's really important for them to be funny around each other.
Yeah. I think that there's a level of that where, like, there is a time for humor, right? And I think that guys and girls both do that. But I think that when there are other situations that present themselves, many guys will just keep going to that humor well.
Right.
Whereas, if you're having a really rough day, like, I think it's a fairly common occurrence for a group of guys to try and laugh it off or joke about it. Not always, but that is certainly something that I think men go to, where they think that women are often more likely, at least in our cultural settings, to address that situation with a little bit more emotional intelligence and a little bit more seriousness.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I noticed about meeting guys at college is so many of them, they just felt mean. I would talk to them about things, and they would mock me because they were trying to be funny. For them, being funny was in some sense more important than caring about how I felt. And I mean, it is mean-spirited. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, but I don't think that they were doing that maliciously. I don't think they wanted to hurt my feelings. These guys just didn't recognize that there's a time and a place where humor aren't valuable.
I think that there's a level of humor that is not even about being funny. It's not it's not about a pull towards being funny, but a push away from being genuine.
Absolutely.
And I think that I use the word genuine. Maybe it's not the best word for the situation, but I think that there's often a stigma of just like having genuine interest in something, whether that is chemistry or Marvel or even video games or even sports. I think that often there is a concept that isn't really spoken that men, you're interested in something, but it doesn't really matter that much to you. Take school. I think that there is a thought for some guys that you should be passively, being smart, being good at school, getting good grades, not being a huge slacker. Like, those are good things, I think, in the male thought. But to say, like, I love learning, I really love going to school, I love going to classes, I just think it's so fascinating, and to genuinely, passionately be interested in school or interested in biology or interested in Marvel in a way that isn't just passing or isn't just for looks or isn't just because it's fun or looks good, I think is something that many kind of cultural settings don't promote for men.
Yeah, I agree.
And so by being funny, you can be interested in something, but make a joke about it.
Right.
Or even just in observations of the world. You say you see a really nice sunset, you can say, "Oh, look at that beautiful sunset, you know. Real shame that someday it's going to consume the earth."
And all the guys will laugh.
I think that allows, you know, someone to appreciate the beauty of a sunset without coming off as soft.
Yeah.
Almost,
yeah.
or without coming off as, you know, that you can appreciate this while still tearing any sort of emotions that it evokes in you to shreds.
Yeah, certainly. Man, talking about all these things has really, I guess, brought them to the forefront of my mind. And as I've been thinking about this and listening to you talk about them, how do we facilitate cultures and places where men can find emotions can have emotions valued, and that's something that's important. Because, you know, you've alluded to this already, but I want to make very clear, humans are holistic creatures, right? You can't just not have emotions. That's not something you can do as a person. People express them and experience them very differently, but to some extent, you can't just not have emotional intelligence and continue to be a successful person, or to be a happy person. How do we create cultures and environments and families even where our sons don't have to get lucky like we did, but that being a good man, which means being an emotive man, is kind of the default. Certainly it begins with things like not saying, you know, it begins with things like don't say boys don't cry. Encourage and talk about emotions with your sons, with your kids. I had an experience just last night. I was very sad and I wanted to cry and I couldn't.
Oh yeah, I can only cry if I'm talking to someone.
Yes.
I can be in the worst shape ever, and I will call someone and be like, I just need to cry, and I can't do it unless I explain why to you.
I mean, I called you like that back in August. I needed to cry, and I called you up.
Yeah.
And that there's this strange thing about being male that's been stuck in me, where, you know, I know women who cry 4 nights a week. I don't necessarily want to go that far, but I think it is cathartic. It is useful. It is a nice way to say, yes, I am feeling that emotion when I'm crying.
Yeah. And to be able to kind of get it out of your system.
Yes.
Now, certainly, like, crying all the time is often, like, not a symptom of something worse. But I think what we are specifically pointing at is not, like, is being able to cry when we know we should.
Absolutely. There have been a number of situations in my life where I said, I should be crying right now. I would like to be crying right now. And I can't do it. And that has been incredibly frustrating for me. And I'm not sure how to go about addressing that, I guess. Because it is important for me to be emotionally expressive in social situations. It came up last night. A friend was telling me a very sad story, and I wanted to cry to show sympathy for them. They broke down and weeping, and I wanted to be able to express sympathy with that, and I couldn't, and I felt like it was a barrier for me socially that I couldn't really connect and support with this person.
Yeah, and I think that moving forward as a society and also as individuals, like we've talked a lot about the ways where we have been lucky with our, you know, friend group of dudes, or how we have been improved. But I think, you know, both of us would certainly say we're not perfect. There are certainly areas where we still want to improve, personally and interpersonally. And so I think maybe kind of going into how do we think we move forward, I think we've alluded to, you know, moving forward to as a society. But, like, say one of our listeners was a college guy who wanted to have a, you know, deeper connection with some of his guy friends and didn't really know how to address that, or wanted to be more emotionally intelligent himself. What would we say to them? Something
we mentioned earlier is initiating conversations that are emotional and vulnerable, is intimidating.
Lead by example.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, someone's got to do it. If it's valuable to you, it may as well be you. Another thing that I would recommend, you actually inspired me to do this, is track your emotions. the first step for me to becoming emotionally competent and able to talk about emotions with other people is being aware of and having names for my own emotions. And so when I began this journey of I want to have emotional intelligence, I began tracking a lot of things in my life that were related to emotion and mood. You know, how do you feel? What emotions did you experience today? And other things that can affect mood, like sleep and eating and social time and things like that. And being really intentional about being conscious of my own emotions has proved incredibly helpful. I was just reflecting this afternoon. About a year ago today, I had a stressful week in school. I mean, it's coming near the end of the semester. I've got a lot of stuff to do this week even. And about a year ago today, I was having a stressful week in school and failed to recognize the symptoms of stress and anxiety, and it built up over the course of the week into really a massive panic attack that proved destructive in some relationships because I was forced to offload this emotional burden on people who were not prepared to take it. I wouldn't call it a breakdown, but it was destructive in a lot of ways. This week, I'm also feeling very stressed. I've got a lot on my plate, but being able to name my own emotions and recognize them before they hit a crisis level has been incredibly valuable. Now I recognize, hey, I'm feeling stressed. I'm going to go on a run. And instead of building up for a week, I can address it at the root, and even just naming emotions helps.
Yeah, that's really good. Like an intelligent and adaptive way of dealing with feelings and emotions, which everybody has.
Yes.
I think that the first step, if towards becoming better yourself, or engaging with men or women, whoever you are really, if you want to be better at understanding your own emotions, the emotions of others, and forming deeper connections with people, I think the first step is to check yourself in terms of if you are feeling. I think often, I know that when I was younger, there were times where just like, I know that I am emotional, but I didn't know if I was angry or sad or lonely or stressed. Like you mentioned, getting to a point where you can be feeling bad and kind of slowly start working towards putting a name to what bad feeling are you feeling.
Yes.
Is a very large scale terms of kind of checking in on yourself. But I think also just in little things you say, like if you say that sunset is beautiful and you feel that sunset is beautiful, and then the next thing you say is too bad it's going to consume the earth, and you make a joke about it, there's nothing wrong with making jokes. I make jokes all the time, but just little things that you say, just kind of in your head, try and get into a habit of checking yourself, especially if it is an emotionally charged statement or in an emotionally charged situation. Be like, is that actually a joke I want to make right now, or would it be better if I was just quiet and enjoyed the beautiful sunset? Or if you are talking to a friend who has had a rough day, you don't have to be perfect at first, but try and think before you speak or after you speak. Be like, oh, I just kind of brushed that off. Maybe I should have probed a little bit deeper. And if you are in a circle where that's unusual for guys, like there might be some resistance. And you shouldn't push people to open up more than they want to. But you can push a little bit. I think that often what I've tried to do, and I think our friend group kind of got into a habit of, guys and girls, which I really appreciated, is, there's the classic, oh, how's your day been? And people almost always say good or fine or whatever. But if someone could kind of detect that someone wasn't maybe being, there was a little bit tongue-in-cheek when they said, oh, it's going great, just kind of look in their eyes and be like, how's it actually going? And that seems like a very, very small thing, and in some ways it is. But it can make a huge difference of just being like, instead of someone saying, oh, it's been an amazing day, and they're being sarcastic, instead of being like, oh yeah, one of those, really sucks, being like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Just those little kind of entry roads, because I think that there are, at least in my experience, there are a lot of guys who don't have those connections, and it can initially feel awkward, but even once you get to a point of a little bit of more emotional intimacy, it can feel very right and very good.
Yes. And being able to just share emotional burdens reduces their weight significantly.
Most definitely. It reduces, the weight you have to carry, but then it also removes this whole element of shame. I think that there are lots of times where, especially in groups of guys, being vulnerable about any sort of shortcoming or struggle, especially if it's about being uncertain about your own emotions or knowing that you're struggling but not knowing what really to do, carries with it the weight of those things on their own, but also carries with it the stigma and shame of weakness and the fear of being laughed at.
Yes. And we've touched on some of the costs earlier when we mentioned male anger and some of the destructiveness that has in society. But I want to be very explicit here. Men are expected to be just tough and fine and emotionless, and that's not who men are, and it's incredibly destructive to men. 80% of suicides in the United States are committed by males.
Successful suicides, yeah.
Yes, successful suicides. And men are incredibly lonely as a whole. The guys in your life are people. They have vulnerable aspects of themselves, and if there's not a good place for them to share it in society, they're not being fully human, and it can be destructive to their very bodies. So if you are a guy, take care of the guys around you. They're probably lonely.
Take care of your dudes.
Yeah, seriously.
And it's also, I think you can talk a lot about, kind of social or personal, like, deep ramifications. But on a lighter note, it's really nice.
Yeah.
It is work. It is work to get there, and it is more work to maintain. I'm not going to lie. Like, being willing to pick up the phone at 10 o'clock at night and listen to one of your guy friends cry for 2 hours, it's work.
It's exhausting.
But it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Because on the other end, you have a support structure that, A, is not dependent on a relationship, which is a big deal, because often I know that guys really struggle with dealing with breakups. Now, everyone struggles with breakups, but I think guys often struggle in terms of at least processing in a healthy way a breakup more than women, because often women are better at supporting each other. There is that support network there, whereas I think there are many men who their only support network is romantic relationships. And so
Yes.
If that is broken, which is often extremely emotionally stressful, they got nowhere to turn.
Yes, absolutely. We've mentioned this before. It also just makes your life better, right?
Definitely.
I have been more productive, more happy, more stable since I began being intentional about my emotional intelligence. I just feel better. It's like working out after having spent 3 years of not working out. You feel better.
Yeah.
Humans are holistic animals. We have a mind, we have a body, we have an emotive aspect, we have spiritual aspects to ourselves, and it's often easy for us to abstract humans down or to forget about caring for all those aspects of yourself, but they're all important, and if you don't have all of them, you're missing out on what it means to be fully human.
Yeah, and I think to kind of, I think we're wrapping up here to kind of come more full circle. Even the parts of being a man that society values, whether that's physical fitness or being tough or being strong or being a leader, to do those in the best way possible, to do those in the ideal way, in a way that is less tainted by the negative aspects that can come along with those, you need to be emotionally intelligent. So even if your only goal was to be the best stereotypical man you could be, I would still tell you that emotional intelligence is important, because to be strong, you need real strength. And real strength doesn't come from ignoring problems or anger. Real strength comes from having other people to rely on, from getting help, and from being able to process things in an intelligent way. So if you want to be strong, you need to understand yourself and have people you can rely on. And if you want to be a leader and you want to be someone people look up to, that is a great thing for men and women, but it's a stereotype for men that's what you're supposed to be. Well, if you want to be a leader, you need to first understand other people and
Yes.
understand yourself. You cannot lead others if you cannot lead yourself. Mm-hmm. If you can't control your own emotions, how do you expect to control others?
The book of Proverbs says, a man without self-control is like a city without walls. You're out in the world, you're defenseless, you're vulnerable, you're uncontrolled. You've got this weak spot to you. And it doesn't matter if you're the most inspiring leader, if you're the strongest bodybuilder, if you are an aggressive entrepreneur who can go out and get stuff done. If you can't ground yourself and tether yourself with an emotional intelligence, you're going to be lacking in a lot of what's really important, and you're going to miss opportunities. And raw power without that control isn't as useful.
Even things that are more, maybe superficial, like humor, that gets better too if you're emotionally intelligent for multiple reasons. One, if you understand your own emotions better, you will be better able to kind of sort out, okay, what is a joke to me and what is serious, and you can invest, energy appropriately. But also by being able to kind of read the room a little bit better, you won't run into situations as often as your friend or the guy you were talking to at your university did. Of you would be better at recognizing, like, oh, this is really important to this person, so I'm not going to joke about it with them, and I'll make a joke over here that they're going to like and they're going to laugh about. And then I think the goal of humor is often to connect with people and make them feel good.
Yes.
And then, if you know where to make a joke, it'll land well. And if you know where not to, and you know where to say, oh, hey, that sounds really interesting, tell me more about it, you're going to form better connections with people. So on every level, emotional intelligence and working towards being self-effacing and forming groups of guys that genuinely care about each other and care about what each other are interested in, how they're doing, how they're feeling, and are willing to support them and not ridicule them, that is not a sacrifice. We're not asking people to sacrifice the traditional idea of what it means to be a man. I think that there are many problems with gender roles, but I think that there are useful aspects to them too. There is value in identifying in what being a man means to you. Now, I think that society needs to leave more room for people to pick different choices for what being a man means to them. But I think that there are a lot of men who do kind of fit of their own volition into what society says about men, but they fall short, and I'm in this boat too, of achieving that in a way that is adaptive and healthy.
Yeah.
You don't have to sacrifice wanting to be a strong man. You don't have to sacrifice being that ideal to be emotive. In fact, I think it would get you closer to that. What you have to sacrifice is the idea that being strong means never being weak.
Yes. Something you said a little bit earlier resonated with me, and I want to go back to it, which is guys shouldn't feel like they have to be alone, and you shouldn't feel like strength means that you're alone. It's a terrible lie that our society tells us, that strength means you can do it all on your own.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what makes humans strong is our communities, our reliance on each other and connections.
I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, a psychological perspective, many spiritual perspectives, strength is in numbers. Strength is in connections. Strength is in knowing when to ask for help.
Absolutely.
And that is something that I think we fail to teach men in our society.
Yes. So, we don't have a big audience, but I hope that this insight into our lives and what we've found valuable here is useful in your life as well. That it can be inspiring and valuable. If you have questions, if you want to know more about this, we would be happy to talk with you about it. Reach out.
Yeah, there's a way that you can send messages on Anchor. You can also leave comments on the YouTube version of this video. Also, in the description of this podcast, whatever player you're viewing it in, I am planning on linking to the podcast's email, which we didn't do last time after we asked for questions.
Yes.
So even if someone did want to ask a question, they didn't really have a way of getting it to us. But I'm planning to put that email down there. So whether you have an idea for maybe a future topic or this topic really interests you, reach out.
Yeah,
we got ideas. We love talking.
We'd be happy to talk with you. I mean, we sit here for 2 hours every other week and just talk, and we love to talk. So,
because talking to guys is cool.
It's true. This has been another week of In My Experience. I'm James.
I'm Noah. Thank you so much for listening.
And we hope you tune in 2 Tuesdays from now.
All right. I love you, James.
Love you too, Noah.